hope you're having a great day so far. There's been so many interesting talks and demos. I'm so excited for this panel. I feel like this panel is a perfect mix of philosophy, technology, innovation, and everything in between. I think just to start out, if someone was to look at the companies you're building 5 or 10 years ago, which are basically finding ways to replicate human emotion authentically and human creativity, they could rightfully be very freaked out and have a very dystopian lens. So just to put it out there, like, how do you guys think about building in this space, why you're doing it, and yeah, I'm curious, like, why you chose this.
Yeah, I think when people think about emotion and what they're doing with their face and voice, it gets personal, but you have to realize that applications are going to use that data, that it's going into AI models, and if those AI models aren't explicitly tuned to respond in a way that's conducive to you feeling better, they're not going to, right? That's, I think, the dystopian reality. I think the utopian reality that's actually realistic, not like a utopia, but is that these AI models could actually be fine-tuned for your well-being, and you can trust them to have your own personal well-being in mind when they're making decisions. And for that, they need to understand how you express yourself and the proxies of your well-being that exist in your voice and your facial expression and your behavior.
So I think that the approach that we took first was, if you think about like what goes into making a model, it's data, specifically in music and creativity. It's like artistic output that is owned by someone. And so what we were advocating early on for was that an artist should own their models. They should own the ability to publish those models and essentially set like almost like licensing terms for how that data is used, whether it's their fans or whether they license, like essentially like expose an API, which is what we did with Grimes and her app Elf Tech. The second piece of it is like not necessarily thinking about it as like generative AI. I think that like in the creator community, it's almost like AI has started to become like a bad term. And so we looked at it as like, well, what is AI actually enabling for creators? And we think it's actually, in music specifically, it's enabling a new era. Like we're kind of like post-streaming, and I think that we're gonna go into like a music gaming era where you're able to play with music and participate within music creativity instead of just being like a passive lean-back listener. And so I think that's where it takes the dystopian view away, and it makes it more about like a new form of engagement and consumption versus, hey, machines are now going to be doing all the creativity for all time now.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's really interesting that you are building in music gaming space, because at some point, probably soon, the idea of just a music generating model will like lose its novelty. But then, so you're really like doubling down on having people continue to engage and interact with it and building like a whole sort of like user experience around that. Very excited to use it soon. So you're both heavily investing in voice. We talk every day, but the first applications that most consumers have been exposed to were ChatGPT, and it's very text-based. Like, why do you believe that voice will be the default mode of interaction?
Yeah, there's some mundane reasons, like the fact that you can speak a lot faster, you can type. And you can also be looking at other things while you're speaking and reading or hearing rather than reading text. It's compatible. It's like a completely different dimension of the interface. The visuals can all stay the same. You can still have your graphical user interface, but it can be overlaid with a whole new modality that is more conversational, that learns from your voice, that is faster, that you can interrupt. I mean, text just kind of shoots off, and you can't interrupt it.
And you have to press pause.
You have to press pause. And it just doesn't learn from anything because there's no time to correct it until it's completely done. And by that time, it's generated so much text, it's just cognitively taxing. This is much more of a human way of interacting. It's the reason that humans enjoy talking to each other, right? It's not as taxing as texting. You can get more done faster. There's a reason people enjoy that. And so that's how we're going to interact with intelligence.
I think once again, in music, people are not, maybe fully aware of how like music songwriting and production works, but a lot of times it's a bunch of people in a room talking to one another. And like most of the best producers, the way in which they produce music is by directing other people, like talking to a musician and saying, hey, play this guitar this way, I want to hear the note this way. Same thing with speaking to an engineer and being like, hey, like, I want you to use this plugin. So there's a lot of like delegation that's actually taking place by voice, whether it's like an artist and a songwriter collaborating back and forth. Like the actual writing maybe only happens over text or something like that, like when you're like sharing random ideas with one another, but a lot of it's through voice. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have a question really relates to what both of you guys are working on, but if you were to like evaluate ChatGPT's response to something, it's sort of like obviously correct or incorrect. When you are evaluating the output of a song that gets created, or how good that like Grimes' voice goes over my voice, or the emotional intelligence that it read on me and then how it responded, these are harder to evaluate. Like, what types of systems have you guys put in place to do that? How are you thinking about building it and improving it?
Yeah, I think generally with AI, it's much easier to collect data on what's correct and incorrect. It's much harder to collect data on things that are aesthetic and subjective that can be infinitely better than they are, that people really enjoy in a kind of subjective, emotional way. And I think the main way that we express emotion is through the voice, through facial expression, through these modalities that we're able to study. So we use those for feedback. We also collect controlled psychological data, because it's a very deep psychological thing, how you evaluate these models. And we build on a lot of psychological expertise to do that with people interacting with these models in controlled settings, trying to get things done. So these models definitely require a different kind of evaluation versus a model that's just trying to get everything right on a quiz. Like, that's the easy part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the type of evaluation you're referring to is like taste and curation. Yeah. When we were building the model for Grimes' voice, we actually open sourced all of her music files and stems, and it was sort of almost like a call to action of like other developers of like voice models to like make their own model and host it. And because we had music engineers on our team, they were able to sort of like curate what went into that model to make it sound as good as it sounded. And just by nature of that type of like taste and curation, it became the model that people want to use versus another model that's out there. So I think when it comes to the creative fields, like when you think about like Midjourney, for instance, I think that they're the best image model right now. Yeah. It's like it's clear that there's like taste going into that versus any other model that exists. And I think that's going to be the case across for all generative AI in the creative fields. It's going to be, are you hiring some of the best artists to work with your engineers?
Totally, because most people are still learning how to prompt, so there's going to be some inherent like aesthetic that it puts forth. So I think that totally makes sense. And then with voice, it kind of opens up these new possibilities of new user interfaces and like UI, UX. What is exciting to you in that domain, where it's not just like, you're not just texting, you're using your voice, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in what that actually looks like?
I think that's why like we pivoted into this space of what we're calling like music gaming, and I think that the interfaces that we're exploring are like, what happens if you had a controller, like a PlayStation controller, and that's how you were playing with the AI. And so we're trying to figure out what does that experience look like web first. Because it's easy to get those types of like iterations out and test on that. And so the next game that we launch is gonna have that feeling of like, the way I pictured it in my mind, and we say it internally is like that up, up, down, down, left, right. If you played like Nintendo back in the day, like cheat code mentality of like getting to making a loop or getting to making a song. And so that's what we think are like the next UIs for playing with music.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think the coolest thing about voice is that it frees up your eyes and hands. So you can be clicking on things, you can be looking at things. It can actually, the UI can be generated because you're not having to read text. And I think that those are where some of the most exciting innovations are happening in user interfaces. I think that we're not going to cede control to like AI agents that go off and do things on their own for a long time, for many reasons. But we will give power to AI agents that can help us control an interface that we can actually at any time step in and take over. And I think that that's where the real value is. So being able to ask an AI to do anything an application can do. It could read all your front-end code, for example, in advance, so it knows what your app can do. Being able to ask it to do those things, I think, will be huge. Bring you to the right page, click on the right buttons, send the right API calls, right? All just by voice, single voice commands. Things that would take you like 10, 15 minutes, or maybe like an hour to figure out, you can do in 1 second. I think that's the future.
So I think you guys are both doing something very inherently unique and interesting. And there's so many companies popping up today. There's a lot of talk that a lot of them are just rappers. And that might not even be a bad thing, because if someone gets enough users quickly enough, that could be a really interesting business. But what I think has been interesting about your approach is like you're also doing a lot of research. So as a startup with limited resources compared to some of the other players in this field, like how do you allocate resources between research versus production and like staying ahead of the curve versus building for what's possible today?
I think it's important to not just be a rapper, but it's also important to be more integrated with the application than some of these foundation models. So there's this big gulf between what these foundation models do and what you want them to do in the application, and a lot of post-training involved in getting them to do those things. So that's really where a startup can step in and gather the right kind of data, actually invent new methods in AI that aren't extreme. It's not like training a whole new foundation model from scratch with all of the internet, right? That's not something a startup's going to do. But adding in emotion understanding through controlled psychological data, through application data, through developer data, and being able to fine-tune models to do the things you want them to do in the application, I think is a huge place for startups to invest. And so we end up splitting things pretty equally between research and production.
Yeah, I would say we have a kind of like a 50-50 approach, and the research on our end is highly focused on like how do we actually build a model that remunerates rights holders. I think that's the most important thing when it comes to any of the creative industries, and specifically music. Music has always been sort of like a field where you're making something off of like what you've heard before, no matter what anybody says. And so there's like this sort of like giving back and taking from this source well of inspiration. And without that incorporated into what the foundational models of music are going to be, you're just going to have that dystopian world. So like we have to spend quite a bit of time thinking about like what can go into making a model that does that, and also having a user experience that simulates core aspects of music making, which is like play, performance, collaboration. If you remove all those things, you're just sitting there being like, make this, and then it comes out. It's kind of boring.
Totally. I have to ask you guys about copyright just because of the whole Scarlett Johansson OpenAI situation that is occurring. Even if what training data do you think is fair to use, not fair to use? And then where's that line of like something sounds similar to this person's voice or kind of looks like their face, but it's different? Personally, like how are you guys kind of steering your ship?
Yeah, I think it's really important that the people who create the data that you're training models on are okay with what you're doing. And there's a good way of doing that, which is not to compete with them, and to be on their side and to take their feedback. Particularly with voice, there's the voices that we kind of pre-train, but there's also the voices that you deploy, and that's where it gets particularly sensitive because that's a person's identity. You definitely don't want to impersonate somebody without their permission, right? And in fact, all the voices that we offer currently are people who work at the company. So
You could get a Alan voice. Nice.
luckily, we've hired a lot of empathic people, so they're very good personalities. We actually have a lot of mastery over how you control the personality and make it appropriate for the context and the user's application.
So we launched our first app, like I said, with Grimes, obviously with her permission and her publicly stating sort of her licensing terms. And the way the application works is like anybody can come use her voice, and once they decide to distribute that voice, they pay like $9.99 to distribute that song. But what they're paying for is like the usage of her name, image, likeness. And so that's going back to what I was saying. It's like that's not a part of a foundational model, but it's like the first kind of look at how business models can operate in terms of remunerating artists, and fairly training on someone's data and information. Yeah.
And then just to bring it down to the model level, I'm curious, like, how are you guys thinking about using closed source versus building on top of open source models? Where are you at today, and kind of where do you see the future headed? Because there's a lot of cool open source models being built. There's smaller models. There's a lot coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, we build on top of open source. So, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. You don't want to have to reinvent the wheel to be operating on that domain and be able to continue fine-tuning models, post-training, doing all of the work that needs to be done to link voice modality and a good personality to all of the different models that you can use. And ultimately, I think a lot of companies are going to really regret just using closed APIs if they can't then use that interface data to improve their next model, unless it's the company that made that closed API. You're basically wedded to that, right? Because if you use that data later on, it's basically distilling the model. So you want to work with a company like us that's willing to let you do stuff with that data later on, and able to help with that, in fact.
Yeah, we're using open source models, and to initially build the initial architecture, and our plan is, as we move towards like deploying a foundational model, the focus is to make that open source as well. We think like specifically as it relates to the music industry, there needs to be sort of like standard open models that any record label or any type of rights holder can essentially like fine-tune their own models, or build their own models if they want to. That's the only way I think that will continue to create like a vibrant, competitive music ecosystem.
Awesome. My last question for you guys is going to be a little philosophical, but I think last year there was a lot of discussion around AI girlfriends and no one's going to date in real life, and then it sort of faded, and it's certain people like chatbotting. But now when you have this reality of these like super creative, empathetic models that are maybe even better at understanding what someone needs from you than most people are, and they're more emotionally intelligent than a lot of us, when you look out in the future in 20 years, what do you think sort of AI companions will look like? Will they be embodied? Will they be something a lot of people use? They might be therapists. They might be significant others. What's your personal take? And it can be both dystopian and positive, but I'm just curious. I just am so curious about this.
So, I mean, there's going to be a proliferance of models that you interact with. The problem is that if they're smarter than you, you're not going to want to interact with the ones you don't have an established relationship, that you don't trust, because they can manipulate you. I mean, just like humans, right? You don't want to work with untrustworthy people that seem to be able to pull one over on you at any time and have like a lot of intelligence and power, and give them access to your applications or your data. You don't want that, right? So it's very important for people to be able to bring models with them that they trust. And so in the future, in 20 years, you could have a companion that has a recognizable voice, that is interoperable across many applications. So you can take it and you can imbue it into the next robot that you buy, and it becomes operated by your companion, and you trust it. And for that to happen, you need to be able to separate out some of the decision-making that the AI makes from like each new frontier model. You need to have this be a separate model that can kind of reprocess data that other AI models are giving it. And you always trust that this new model output is the output from the model that you know and care about, that cares about you, and can tell you if somebody is trying to rip you off or like manipulate you or like give you misinformation. So I think that's going to be a really important part of the future.
Well, I tend to think about like, well, who's going to be behind training, these models or these chatbots, whatever you want to call them, entities. And I think, going back in the case of what we, launched with Grimes, there is like a Twitter bot that exists where it's Grimes AI. It's tweeting every day. There's a Discord bot that is sort of like an aspect of, her personality, where her fans get to talk to it every day. And it's sort of like positioned as almost like social media science fiction. So it's more about like character creation and storytelling and creating a new type of fan experience. And so like if I think like 5-10 years out, I think these become like new forms of entertainment more so than just like companionship. Because I think that there are people who maybe want that and seek that. But there are a lot of people who are just like looking for new forms of entertainment, almost like a new trainer, right? Like a new way like to improve yourself. And it's what I think is like as long as you have people behind it who are attempting to tell stories and guide these, chatbots until like they take over and then destroy the world, I guess. But if that doesn't happen, then it's just more like you have like artists being artists behind that, right? Being able to like fine tune and tend to the model.
Totally. I remember you told me a while ago about Hatsune Miku, which is an AI-generated artist in Japan. And when I first heard about it, I was like, oh no, but I need the personal story behind an artist to like love them enough to buy a ticket to go to their concert. But then there's videos of like filled out stadiums to see this AI-generated hologram and people are crying and they know everything about her story. And so it's like, actually, we're very adaptable to these realities and we can buy into a lot of things. So anyway, thank you guys so much. It's so interesting. Very excited to see the future of Hume and CreateSafe and keep following your demos.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.